It's pretty clear that humans have been very parasitized since time immemorial, most likely. But the point being that these things were constant present on and in our body throughout our evolution. And to do that, they have to sort of take control of your immune system because your immune system would otherwise just expel them. So you can imagine that we've evolved with this constant pressure on our immune system. The pressure is basically a pro-tolerogenic, to use a sort of jargonistic word, but that just means that it's convincing your immune system to tolerate things. We have outsourced some of our development of the circuits of our immune system that help you hold back your firepower, that help you control your responses, to help you not melt down. We have outsourced the development of those circuits to Helminths just because they've always been there trying to convince our immune system that they belong.
Hey folks, welcome back to High Intensity Health Radio. It's your host, Mike Mutzel, and I'm super excited to be live with Moises Velasquez Manoff. He's the author of this amazing book, which I can't recommend enough, called An Epidemic of Absence. Hopefully you can see that. The subtitle is A New Way of Understanding Allergies and Autoimmune Diseases. And today we're going to talk about the details of that. And Moises, I think a great launching place would be give us an overview of the disease scape. As you know, the microbiome is such a hot topic right now. It's kind of almost a kitchen table topic, but as we were talking about offline, a lot of folks are kind of ignoring the Helminth side, the parasites, and these are the other quote unquote microbes that inhabit our gut and contribute to immune system regulation and immune system tolerance. So maybe give us an overview of this landscape so we can kind of launch and take a deep dive.
Of the diseases that we're talking about?
Well, of the diseases and the role that Helminths play.
Gotcha.
I guess
okay.
The evolutionary perspective, like how our immune system evolved with these bugs and suddenly they're not there anymore, and how that's affecting the predisposition towards autoimmune inflammatory diseases.
Yeah. Well, there's a great, there is a little sort of subfield of archaeology that studies fossilized feces called coprolites. And the reason why it's pertinent to your question is because basically anywhere they look at fossilized human feces in latrine pits or in mummies or what have you, it's pretty clear that humans have been very parasitized since time immemorial, most likely. And the reason you can say that is because when you look around the animal kingdom, there's no animal that don't have parasites. And by some estimates, actually, there are more parasitic species in existence than there are non-parasitic species. But the point being that these things were constant present on and in our body throughout our evolution, and they do something very strange to your immune system, which is that they sort of convince your immune system that they belong. That's how they survive. I mean, their life strategy is basically to take up long-term residence in your body for a few years, depending on the species, 2 to up to decades for some of the schistosome species. And that whole time they're sort of feeding off either your food or off you or something like that, and shedding eggs, and those eggs then go out into the world and hatch or become infected larvae and then find new hosts. So, but they're a long-term strategy, and that's as opposed to like a cold where it's just a virus that gets in your body, replicates like mad, and then your immune system basically evicts it. These organisms have a very different strategy, which is that they live for a long time in your body. And to do that, they have to sort of take control of your immune system because your immune system would otherwise just expel them. So you can imagine that we've evolved with this constant pressure on our immune system. The pressure is basically a, it's pro-tolerogenic, to use a sort of jargonistic word, but that just means that it's convincing your immune system to tolerate things. And so there's this influence pushing your immune system towards tolerance that's been there since time immemorial. And that if you think of other things that we've had since time immemorial, you actually sort of become dependent on them to have normal physiological functioning. And one of the examples I use in my book is that of vitamin C, just that like all other, vitamin C is absolutely necessary for certain cellular processes. And most other animals actually generate their own vitamin C. Primates, for some reason, lost that ability. And the idea is that if you have a fruit-rich diet, you no longer need to manufacture your own vitamin C, or better explained, if that gene that helps you manufacture vitamin C just mutates, stops working, there's no cost. There's no cost to your fitness because you're eating plenty of fruit. In that moment, you become dependent on this external, you basically have outsourced your vitamin C production to plants. And that's what primates have done. The same thing can be said of our immune system. We have outsourced, at least the theory goes, some of our development of the circuits of our immune system that help you hold back your firepower, that help you control your responses, to help you not melt down. We have outsourced the development of those circuits to Helminths just because they've always been there trying to convince our immune system that they belong forever.
That's really fascinating. In your book, you talk about switches, and so we have a broken off switch. And so is that right? And then talk about the T regulatory cells. So it's my understanding after reading your book and after reading a lot of the microbiome and autoimmune research is the T-Reg cells are very important in the induction of this immune tolerance. And that's really kind of the mechanism by which these helminths and parasites work. Is that right?
Yeah, that's one of the mechanisms. I think it's one I focused on in the book because it was concrete and they're real and they're getting studied. But the truth is that actually it seems like every cell subset has a regulatory version. So like there are B regulatory cells now. The dendritic, the cells that are sort of the front line of your immune system that are the ones that when there's some invader on the way, they grab a chunk of that invader and then go and educate the rest of the immune system. They're called dendritic cells. Those also have a regulatory version. There are other ones called macrophages that eat cells. They have a regulatory version. So basically your whole immune system, every subset has a regulatory version. But yes, there's plenty of research on these T-regs, and a functioning sort of subset of regulatory T cells as opposed to attack cells. I mean, there are various ways to imagine them. You can imagine them as officers in an army. Like they tell the rank and file what to attack and when to hold back. You can imagine them as, you know, in those K9 units, the officers that hold the dogs on the leash.
Yeah.
You can imagine them like that. But like there's usually, it's thought that around like 10 to 15% in a healthy person of your T cells should be regulatory T cells, meaning the rest are attack cells. And numerous studies show that if you remove those cells, the attack cells just go crazy, causing not just autoimmune disease, but overreaction to any kind of immunological stimuli, like a cold or whatever. You just sort of melt down. Your immune system is totally unleashed on everything. And actually, there's a genetics disease that sort of led to the discovery of these cells where the T-regs are essentially incapacitated. And these kids don't live very long because they develop multiple autoimmune diseases. They get a cold, their whole immune system goes haywire. And this sort of highlighted the importance, maybe for the first time, of this subset of T cells in controlling your own immune response, and also highlighting that your immune system is dangerous to you, even though your immune system also protects you. It can, in too much, in too high quantities, if the firepower is too great, you're the one who suffers. You know, you basically shoot yourself in the foot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating stuff. But it's not just the immune system, and that's what I love about your book, where you talk about the helminths actually control levels of hormones, and you get into, I think was it Ethiopian people or people of northern Africa when they moved to the UK, their progesterone levels were different. And so talk to us about kind of the ceiling of hormones, because so many people right now, obviously autoimmune is a huge area of focus and allergies and so forth of your book, which I want to dive into. But before we forget, I want to talk about hormones and how these helminths control or affect our hormonal axis.
Yeah, you know, the bigger story, I think, is that people are realizing that the systems in our body are not separate. So your endocrine system is not separate from your immune system. And there are good reasons, like in terms of if you're in a energy sort of limited environment, that if you're spending a lot on fighting off infections, you're going to spend less on other things, right? Like you're only getting, you know, 1,500 calories a day or something. So you chronic sort of all sorts of chronic infections, that's a cost to your immune system. Your immune system is using energy, using some of those calories to keep some of those those infections at bay, to defend the body. So that means there's less to invest in other areas like procreation, which is you know, your hormone levels are linked to. So what seems to happen, and this is supported also by numerous animal studies, is that literally the moment you infect, for example, an animal, a rat usually, with a helminth, their testosterone levels go down, like all their sex hormone levels go down. So this also, when you study human populations that grow up in environments with lots of infections and lots of parasites, their hormone levels seem to be suppressed relative to westernized populations. And that doesn't always correspond necessarily with a reduction in fertility. It's just that they seem to be able to make better use of the hormones they've got. And what it all suggests, what it adds up to, is that westernized populations, relatively cleaned up, were relatively well fed. We've gotten rid of all those those old diseases, especially the parasitic ones, is that we have this kind of like unprecedented hormonal exuberance that, in terms of our evolution, is a total novelty for our bodies. And you can see that also in modern heights. Like basically, humans have never really been this tall. That's related to some of the growth factors that come along with those hormones. I mean, it's not, we have been this tall, like back in the Paleolithic, supposedly. We were pretty tall then, but for the last 10, 12,000 years, we've been pretty short because we've been sort of beset by food shortages and also by infections. What this adds up to is that a lot of the Western cancers, particularly the ones that are of their reproductive organ cancers, the breast, of ovary, of prostate, testicular, they have gone up in the West. It's always been a question of whether it's a better diagnosis or not. But what these studies suggest, that actually, no, our bodies are different, and part of the answer to that question of why they've gone up has to do with that hormonal exuberance, since a lot of these cancers are sort of responsive to high hormone levels.
Very fascinating. I love how you articulated that kind of the metabolic cost associated with infection. A lot of people don't think about that, that it takes nutrients to mount an inflammatory immune response and so forth. So that's really interesting perspective. So let's go back a little bit and back to chapter 1 or chapter 2 in your book, where you talk about the dirty ape and how humans, like you mentioned earlier, I want to talk about the shift, I guess, the transition from how dirty we have been historically over time to now how clean we are in the context of helminths and whipworms and roundworms. How did that happen, and what sort of forces drove us to be more and more clean?
Well, just to begin with, the reason why we're dirty is because we love being around other people. And so social living breeds pestilence in a lot of ways. And for much of our evolution, we were in small groups, and the kinds of diseases that don't thrive in those small groups, the Paleolithic kind of 70 to 100 people type social networks, are the crowd diseases that later on become the big killers, like the smallpoxes and the measles and so on. They don't really survive in that kind of context, because they have to find a new host before they get evicted from the body, right? So what does survive in those contexts are the parasites. They love just those small groups, and that's probably what that lifestyle is designed for. So they've been around for a long time, the parasites. The crowd diseases come with agriculture, with settled living, beginning, we settled down 9,000, 10,000 years ago, 12,000 in some places. But the crowd disease is probably around 5,000 years ago. Anyways, you can look at the sort of last 15,000 years of human history as a gradual buildup of pestilence and filth that culminates in the Industrial Revolution, where huge migration of people to cities occurs, and there's no sanitation, hardly to speak of, no modern sanitation. And then suddenly in the 19th century, there's this, the sanitary revolution, as it's called, and one of the great health advances of human history, which basically sewers is what it comprises, getting effluents away from, that we're not drinking sewer or drinking water, clean water that's not mixed with the drinking water, and basic understanding of germ theory, which comes along with it. But germ theory is the idea that diseases aren't caused by spirits or miasma, which is like these fumes from the earth, but they're caused by germs, and you can get rid of diseases by getting rid of germs, which was a revolutionary idea in its time, about 150 years, beginning 150 years ago. So suddenly, these genes, this genome that has been sort of exposed to ever increasing quantities of filth and parasite load, ever greater parasite loads, and ever greater number of these crowd diseases like measles, is left without any of that stuff that it has evolved to handle. Or if you're looking at the parasites, left without that influence that was always sort of activating the tolerogenic networks in our immune system, that always taught our immune system to tolerate things, maybe perhaps to our detriment if you have too high of a parasite load. So it's beginning 150 years ago, starting with the upper classes. Basically, these diseases go away, leave the human body, and it continues all the way up. If we're just looking at the West to the to now, really, It's continuing. So, and I should just make something clear there, though, that the things that seem to be protective in terms of autoimmune disease and allergies are not the things that we vaccinate against. It's not, you're not going to get any benefit from avoiding vaccinations in terms of improving your avoiding allergies and autoimmune disease, because those infections, which are sort of a shock to your immune system, aren't the kinds of infections that develop these immunoregulatory circuits.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that. It was a wonderful transition to present day immunoregulation, right? For example, I just got back from Bali, Indonesia, and we're drinking the local water, eating local food and stuff. And we come back and we have our stomach is upset and we're kind of nauseous and feeling uncomfortable and stuff. So what do we do as present day Westerners, right? We're trying to live quote unquote paleo and primal, and real food is a great start because it's good for the microbiome and all that, but we're not getting those bugs. So give us your take on this in terms of how we can take this big picture concept and feed our body these good microbes. I mean, do we drink unsanitary water? What do we do?
No, I don't think that you should do any of that stuff. I mean, I wish I had a good answer to that. People are trying to figure it out. I think what's going to happen is that companies are going to develop a next generation of what they're calling rationally designed probiotics, which I think is a kind of funny term, but also apt. I think what they mean is that, excuse me, I have this thing in my throat.
Go for it.
What they mean is that, so the current generation of probiotics come from fermented food often. They're not FDA approved for anything usually. They're just microbes that have been determined through not always clear means and not always clear science to be good for you. But these are going to be microbes that are truly tested, and they're going to be microbes from the human microbiome, microbes from other people, so that what they're doing is that they're figuring out which microbes in a healthy human are important for those immunoregulatory circuits. And they're doing it by essentially, they'll put them in mice and then they'll just sort of hammer away at them until suddenly the immune system changes and say, okay, what just happened? What just disappeared? And then they'll reintroduce it and see. And those are the microbes that we're going to take in the future. And more often than not, they're not just single species, but like communities. I think that's the sort of realization that's happening among microbiologists, that the microbes exist in communities, not as single species, and they act as communities. So you'll install this entire sort of sub-ecosystem. You'll take it, and I'm not sure how you'll take it. Will you take it once? Will you take it chronically? It's not clear. But that is the direction that the science is moving in. I mean, in terms of, it's probably we're a decade away maybe from that being a reality, something we can take. The best thing to do right now is just to eat enough soluble fiber, which means vegetables, fruits, nuts, veggies, because we already know that's good for you, right? I would love to tell you, go ahead, go find the guy who lives the most natural existence you can imagine. Go find him. He lives in the Amazon, and give yourself a fecal transplant from him, right? I would love to tell you that, but most likely you're going to make yourself sick, because that person is going to carry all sorts of bugs that that may not do anything in him, but because his microbiome is different, maybe it's more diverse, his ecosystem is different, because he also has a different sort of life history, they're going to potentially hurt you dramatically. So I think it's worth being cautious, because if you get some of these things in your microbiome, it's not easy to get rid of. Microbes, unlike parasites, are self-replicating inside of you. So caution is warranted in terms of, but on the other hand, let me backtrack there. The things that have been shown to be, that we know that are probably not that bad for you, that have shown to be protective, are exposure to livestock, like in cow sheds. But the caveat there is that some studies suggest that if you are a city dweller and you just go occasionally to the livestock barn, it actually has the opposite effect that what you want. It actually promotes your it sort of potentiates your allergic liability, so to speak. Like the idea being that you're just getting this little hit here and there. It's not this chronic sort of stimulation, which is what you really need. But like if you want to move to a dairy farm, that's probably going to do you good. It's probably do your kids great. I mean, all the studies suggest it will, and it doesn't. What's the downside there? Maybe I don't think there really is huge downside. The other one is owning a dog. A number of studies show that dogs prevent allergies in kids, and it's most likely because they diversify the microbiome of the house and that you're exposed to, and that they bring in outside microbes. And then there's some scientists here, there's a scientist at UCSF actually, who sort of identified the lactobacilli species that they contribute to the microbiome of your home, and sort of put them in mice and shown how they're protective against allergies. Incidentally, it's actually not direct. It seems it's indirect. It's by they stimulate your immunity against cold viruses. So you're getting a kind of probiotic that works as a kind of vaccine. It's not a vaccine, but it's sort of a semi-vaccine against colds. And colds, certain rhinoviruses, are associated with positive development of asthma. That is, they seem to potentiate your asthma and your allergies. So that's another possibility of things you can do. But and the third, of course, is just, you know, getting outside, getting in the dirt. It's probably not going to help, but it most likely won't hurt either, and you just never know.
Yeah, very fascinating. We caught up with Jeff Leach, and he is the founder of the Human Food Project and studies the gut microbes of folks in Tanzania and so forth. And he recommended very similar advice to that. But so let's take a deep dive, Moises, on the helminths a little bit and talk about the different bugs, because people are hearing more about helminth therapy and for like diseases that don't go into remission. They have a really tough to treat Crohn's or colitis, things like that. They're getting these species overseas. And I want people to kind of understand, if we could, the difference between a parasite and a helminth, roundworm, whipworm, tapeworm. Like what's good, what's bad, what's pathogenic and maybe symbiotic. Can you kind of simplify that for folks?
Well, they're all technically parasites. So the definition of a parasite, basically, the simple definition is that it's taking something from you. That's actually not the sort of old definition. But in any case, they're taking something from you, not contributing to the whole. But this whole theory of parasites being there constantly in our past and sort of being a necessary component of how our immune system develops healthily complicates that idea a little bit, because so maybe they are taking something. Maybe a hookworm sucks your blood, sucks a few drops of blood a day, right? That's definitely taking something from you. But if you, in the bigger picture, it's also necessary to have that sort of influence, that even some of that damage possibly, so that you're developed properly, to have some of that hardship. Then is it really a parasite, or is it more of a kind of symbiont? You know, it becomes a little confusing. You can go out there, you can find plenty of people who say these are all symbionts. Usually people involved in the sort of underground of people who are self-treating, you know, you buy off internet provider. I actually have a story in the works on this community of people. I would just say be skeptical. Just remember they're taking something from you, and they're not entirely benign. It doesn't mean that they can't treat these diseases. Now, to get to the actual scientific evidence of them treating the diseases, it's actually very poor at this point. The one organism that has been studied in a scientifically rigorous way is the pig whipworm, Trichuris suis. It seemed to be almost miraculous in these studies, which were published in 2005, I think, as I recall, and it just had this tremendous promise. Then this company called Coronado Biosciences tried to bring it to market. They did larger studies and total failure. It didn't work at all. No one really can explain it, and I think probably one very likely explanation is that it doesn't work. And who knows about the earlier studies? I mean, there are criticisms of the study, the way it was conducted, but I think we have to accept the possibility that it doesn't really work, and we have to understand that the real prediction of the theory is that if you grow up infected with parasites, that these diseases like allergies and some of the autoimmune diseases aren't going to develop. They're less likely to develop. That's the prediction of the theory. It's a very different proposition to have a disease already that's established, you know, that your immune system is already off balance in a way, and to throw parasites at it and expect the immunoregulation of the parasites to control the disease. It doesn't mean it's not possible, but those are very different propositions. So the former can be true without the latter being true, and so we have no evidence that the latter is true. That being said, you can find like sort of miraculous stories all over the internet, and my inclination is to think that some of those stories are true. but you have no idea if you're reading these stories on the internet about who didn't respond well. You know, the
Mm.
people who got worse. You know, because it's just not the nature of some of these forums to present rigorous information. They're trying to actually. They're trying to sort of correct that, but it's just there's a reason the scientific method exists. Let's put it that way. And the scientific method is basically placebo-controlled, blinded. No one knows what they're getting. A large enough sample size to get a diverse population. It's a pain in the ass to do, but you can trust the results more than you can trust these anecdotes. So the state of whether or not Helminths actually cure disease, I think it's unknown at this point, and the evidence is actually against it if we're to believe this trial that was big enough to be well powered. On the other hand, let me just give you one more caveat because it's a complicated question.
Yeah.
There was this very interesting small study out of the guys in Australia who are working with hookworm. And so their contention is that this organism, the pig whipworm, is not adapted to the human body and therefore was never going to work. Even though, forget those early trials, they say it was never really going to work. They have a human adapted hookworm, Necator americanus, that they infected a very small number of people. It wasn't placebo controlled or blinded or anything. It was like in the teens, in the low teens, as I recall, who had celiac disease. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease triggered by gluten in wheat and other grains. And what they did was they used that influence, the tolerogenic influence of the parasites, to do a kind of desensitization to gluten. So they fed the volunteers over the course of a year ever-growing quantities of gluten. And by the end, these people who had celiac were eating a bowl of like the equivalent of a bowl of pasta with no problem. I mean, which I think is absolutely remarkable. Still a small study, has to be replicated. Actually, they got funding for a larger study. But the really interesting part of the component of that study is they also looked at changes in the microbiome.
Hmm.
Have you seen this study?
Not that study, but in preparation for this call, I did read about the correlation between Helminth infection and microbiome diversity. So I'd love for you to kind of expand on that because I want to talk about that.
So they saw increased richness over time, basically. So, there's this idea that ecosystems generally, when they're more diverse, are healthier. There's an idea in microbiology that the more diverse microbiome is healthier. I think, honestly, if you look really closely, the reasons why that people assume this are not always clear. But I think that the sort of ecological underpinnings are sound. Like diverse ecosystems are generally healthier, more productive, less prone to disturbance, less prone to invasion. So in people, and anyways, in these celiac volunteers, they had a sort of, other studies have shown that people with celiac have a kind of impoverished microbiome, and there's a question of, is it a result or is it a cause? In this case, there was like a kind of restoration of the microbiome in a way, an enrichment over time with the volunteers that had the hookworm. So they don't, there's an interesting interaction emerging between Helminths and the microbiome, where in animal studies, Helminth infection, and by animals I mean rodents, Helminth infections actually seems to not only increase the diversity, but increase the metabolites of the microbiome that are thought to be healthy. So they're like certain fermentation byproducts. There are short chain fatty acids like butyrate and acetate. Acetate is basically vinegar. Butyrate is like in Parmesan cheese. So these things, your microbiome makes these things. If you throw a parasite in there, in a mouse at any rate, it makes more of these things. So like that's just amazing.
Yeah.
It's unexpected.
So basically what I heard you say about, I'll let you cough. Do you need to drink some water or something?
No, I don't know. I just have it's the tail end of one of these colds.
That's all. Yeah, I was there. I know exactly. After traveling to Indonesia, we got pretty sick.
I can imagine.
What I heard you say there, Moises, is the parasites, if we didn't evolve, if we didn't grow up with them, as children, they may not garner a lot of benefits if introduced later in life once we had disease, because our immune system is somewhat set. Is that what we're kind of saying? Is that the malleability, the plasticity is lost with age, so they may not be that beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be some plasticity, but Yeah, I think it's all the evidence indicates that it's really the first few years of life, and especially the first year of life, when these exposures are really important. With helminths, though, helminths come later usually in they come in childhood when you start walking around barefoot. And what they do is they sort of subtly suppress your immune system in real time, so that maybe that just makes, like, if you think of as developing these diseases as a mistake, as a wrong turn in the road that your immune system can take. Having these elements present keeps you more likely to stay on the right path so that you never develop these diseases. I mean, I should point out, you sent me that study on Ethiopia, and it alluded to this. There is a sort of long-standing debate in the literature on whether helminths can actually cause allergies in particular, because, I mean, it has to do with the fact that if you have a helminth infection, all these subsets of cells in your body that have to do with allergy are elevated, right? So it looks like you're having full-blown allergies, but usually those don't correlate to actual clinical allergies. It's just that, well, I mean, I don't know if this is another part of the book, but so the part of your immune system that gives you allergic disease is also the part of the immune system that evolved to deal with helminths, so that if it's sort of occupied with dealing with helminths, it doesn't give you allergies. That's the theory. But it looks like you're a supremely allergic person. Like some of those people in the Amazon who are really parasitized, those Amerindians, their levels of allergic antibodies, the IgE and like eosinophils, which is another kind of cell involved in promoting allergies, are like through the roof, just totally out of control. Hundreds of times higher than, incidentally, someone who has hay fever in the US, but they don't have any allergic disease. That's because that sort of cellular machinery is activated in its proper context, which is fighting helminths.
Really fascinating. So Moises, what advice would you have for people, Westerners that are so sensitive to all the foods now? I mean, it's gluten-free, it's dairy-free, it's corn-free, wheat-free, low histamine diets. I mean, the list of things that people are avoiding is only getting longer, yet we still see leaky gut and headaches and asthma and allergies. So what advice would you offer to those people to get dirty, to maybe, what do you think there?
I don't know. Again, it's this question of there's nothing that's been proven yet. I mean, a lot of this stuff is, I think a lot more people think they have gluten problems than really have them. But on the other hand, I also feel like if you feel like lousy and crappy, whatever makes you feel better, even if you can't explain it, it's worth doing. I just feel like, you can cause other problems by going on a gluten-free diet preemptively without knowing. I mean, if you think you have celiac, you should go get tested. A bottom line, because celiac is a serious disease. But make sure you're eating right. If you're avoiding gluten, for example, that you're getting everything you miss, all the nutrients you miss if you avoid gluten. But more broadly, what you can actually do to improve your health, it's really hard because none of this stuff has been tested, and I feel like it could be just nuanced enough and just wrong enough, some of these theories, that that if you don't account for some of the nuances, you could cause more problems than you fix. So that's why I don't recommend that everyone go out and go find a parasite necessarily.
Let's share your experience because you did that, right?
Which I did, right?
Yeah.
My experience was interesting. It was so I went down to Tijuana, to one of these places that gives you parasites. I got 30 Necator americanus, the human hookworm. I felt pretty bad at first, sort of like, you're warned you'll feel bad. They call it the worm flu. I had GI symptoms, but I also had some positive results. Like I had eczema that went away. I actually had I have an alopecia areata, which is an autoimmune disease that makes it mostly hairless. So I had this like the peach fuzz that started growing here and there. And I was like totally lost my seasonal allergies for about half the season. But then the effects were so variable. Like then they suddenly came back and then they went away again. Like it was this weird, it was like the worms were like, they couldn't give me a constant immune suppression. It was just very variable, and sometimes it seemed like they were actually making things worse in some respects. So this gets back to that argument again about whether are they pro-allergenic or not, or anti-allergenic. And I think it's possible they could be both, depending on the context, depending on the age of your parasites, depending on how many you have. It's depending on the species as well. Uh, I think that as parasites die in your body, because they're actually, the proteins of the parasites are very allergenic, and what they do essentially is put on like a Klingon shield, like invisibility shield, when they're healthy and happy, so that you don't see them, so that you don't get that pro-allergenic. But as soon as that shield is not working, or they can't modulate your immune system, and your immune system starts seeing them, or they start dying and aging and whatever, then you could actually get a pro-allergenic response, because the proteins in parasites are very, very pro-allergenic. They're like cockroaches or dust mites. They're actually the exact same proteins. So anyways, I had this interesting experience. For me, unlike many of the people whom I interviewed, the cons did not, that is, the cons did outweigh the pros. There was too many symptoms. It was too variable, and wasn't predictable enough. But again, I don't have multiple sclerosis. I don't have inflammatory bowel disease. I don't have these other very, very serious conditions that are also can ruin your quality of life, and I have a basically a cosmetic condition, and if that is your baseline, if the pain of Crohn's is your baseline, maybe like the symptoms I experienced are not a big deal, That occurred to me. I also think there's a lot of genetic variability in the human family. People's response is very, very different. There's actually scientific evidence of that. And so how you respond is dependent to some degree on the particular gene variants you carry in your immune system. So I responded kind of forcefully, like unpleasantly for me. Right. Other people have no problem. I interview people that say, "Oh yeah, I took 50 and I never had any side effects." I'm saying, that's crazy.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. What came to mind as you were talking there, Moises, was Lyme disease and Borrelia and Babesia and some of the different Lyme co-infections. With all the experts that you interviewed and folks that you talked to, is there any correlation between Helminth therapy parasites and lack thereof and the expression or susceptibility for Lyme?
I haven't found any science of that. I've thought of that myself, but I don't have any good science on it. I mean, so one theory about Lyme, one emerging theory, is that it actually is a kind of, it triggers an autoimmune disease, right? So that the lingering symptoms of Lyme disease are actually kind of autoimmune disease, because often they can't find the bacterium, but there's like maybe some joint inflammation or what have you. And there was a study a few years ago where there's like bacterial fragments left over that your body's still attacking, possibly. Now, if you were to take an immune suppressant, and would those symptoms go away? I have no idea. Could a Helminth parasite, sort of get you to that sweet spot where immune system is no longer promoting that chronic inflammation, if that's really the cause of Lyme? I mean, these are all like suppositions after supposition. It's an interesting idea. It needs to be explored.
Fascinating.
And I know no one who's exploring it. So
yeah, I don't hear that. I know a lot of doctors that treat Lyme, and they really go after. They use Helminth type therapies. I think some of the different medications are really anti-malarial type drugs and so forth. So it's kind of interesting. But before we go to some final questions, I love talking with you, by the way. This has been really fascinating. Anything about the book that we didn't get to talk about that you want to share with folks?
About the book, I just read it if it's something that interests you. I mean, I think in retrospect, I probably would have written it. If I did it again, I'd write it shorter, maybe. I don't know. But then again, there's a lot of, for people who want to know more, there's a lot of information for those people in the book. So
yeah, you could write a Cliff Notes version for folks that just want to know the kind of take.
Yeah, right. Well, actually, so here's one takeaway I often tell people. It's been a while since I talked about the book, but one of the sort of my discoveries in reporting the book is that that your propensity to develop autoimmune disease and allergic disease is not your fault. It's a function of the environment having changed much faster than our genome can change. And then actually some of the genetic propensity to develop these diseases was good for us in the past in different contexts. It actually helped us survive. Like it helped us fight off infections. It helped us just do day-to-day stuff while under constant assault by all these immune stimuli. So, I mean, that doesn't really like give you the cure-all tomorrow, but maybe it gives you at least peace of mind. Like you get these diseases and no one can explain them to you. The doctor don't really understand how they work, let alone what causes them. And in a way, what the science suggests, this science that I looked into, is that it's not your fault, number one, and number two, that it's that some of the sort of machinery, the genetic machinery that causes these diseases, that was actually good for us in the past, and may be good for us still in reasons in ways we don't understand.
I think that's a really powerful message because people kind of can get this mindset that something's wrong with them, but in fact, like you're saying, they're immune. If you're more susceptible to present day autoimmune disease, and like you mentioned the case of folks that living off in Italy, Sardinia, I think it was, and the mosquitoes and tuberculosis resistance and so forth. So it's a really powerful point, so people don't feel like they're broken or something's wrong with them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
right.
Awesome.
We fail to understand just how much the environment has changed the last 150 years. Like it's just totally different compared to how we all used to live.
Yeah. Love that, Moises. So we want to get to know you a little bit better, and that's kind of the purpose of ending the discussion this way. So if there was one nutrient, herb, or botanical whole food substance that you just could not live without, you feel that it's very beneficial and most people should take it, Moises, what would that be and why?
Yeah, I saw that question. That's a tough one because I've been playing around with this probiotic called Saccharomyces boulardii. It's actually yeast, and it makes you feel better. It can do, this is an old generation of probiotics. It's supposedly not as good as the ones to come. The other one that I found to be helpful is, interestingly, there's an essential oil from lemon rinds called D-limonene. But I wouldn't recommend taking it unless you had some kind of GI issues. But it's actually very powerful and can help a lot of things. I think just eating well on a day-to-day basis is the most important thing. Eating fruits, veggies, whole grains. I mean, if you're going to be paleo and you want to avoid grains, look, if you insist on paleo, I would highly recommend you examine the underlying assumptions, the arguments, because I'm not sure that they're proving to be true. Like there's all these great studies coming out on how we've been eating grains for like 30,000 years, 40,000 years. But in any case, that's a different thing. Even if you are eating paleo, just make sure to eat a lot of vegetables. Exercise. I think the science coming out on fasting is really interesting. Intermittent fasting, maybe you followed some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very fascinating.
It activates all this healing machinery, cellular machinery, and it's healthy for you for reasons far beyond than just restricting calories. It seems to be.
Yeah, really interesting discussion there. Now, what about your morning routine? So we know a lot of successful people, people that are very busy like yourself. You're out there interviewing a bunch of scientists and writing books and articles and so forth. What does the first couple hours of your day look like?
Well, I have young kids, so my first couple hours is I make them food and then I get them to school and daycare, honestly. So I wish I had some strongman routine. I can tell you, ideally, I would get up, I'd do some yoga. In an ideal world, I never hardly ever do that. Maybe I would ride my kids to school on a bike, which I never hardly have time to do. And that would be the ideal thing. But the reality is that I'm just scrambling like every other dad.
Yeah, I hear that. It gets a little wild with food and breakfast and off to school.
Yeah.
Totally get that. So if you were to bump shoulders with Barack Obama, a future president, maybe someone from the World Health Organization, and you just had 30 or 60 seconds to share with them just one health or lifestyle tip that you feel could impact the health of the world, really, what would you want them to know about and why?
Oh, man. Well, I would tell them to read my book, honestly, but because I feel like what I was hoping that would happen with my book, and maybe it's happening to some degree, but is that all the different specialties represented in the research I did would get together and commit to solving this problem, which is a big problem, the problem of these diseases, of autoimmune and allergic diseases, particularly autoimmune diseases. And for autoimmune diseases, they strike women it's like 4 times more often than men. And they would get together and have a serious conversation about how they should go about it in an interdisciplinary way, thinking big picture, like not just coming up with more TNF blockers to treat Crohn's, but like figuring out how to prevent these diseases from emerging and taking this sort of evolutionary perspective, which I think is going to be key. I mean, look, so that's like the evolutionary perspective is sort of already been done. I mean, when it became apparent in the mid 20th century that we needed to exercise more, that's exactly the same argument. You're basically saying our bodies evolved getting a lot more physical activity than we're currently giving them. We need to sort of up that, we need to jog. No one used to jog in the Paleolithic. That they just got it in their daily routine, right? So now we jog and we fixed it. There's got to be that kind of equivalent for our immune system. Like we need to exercise it somehow. We need to replace lost stimuli. And the only way we're going to do it is if we think in this big sort of evolutionary picture. That is not 30 seconds, right? But
that's perfect.
That's what I would want. I would tell Obama, look, get this going at NIH. This needs to be a multidisciplinary effort for a very serious problem, which is it's costing lots of money. It's affecting productivity. It's making people's lives absolutely miserable. And it's not only not going away, it's getting worse. So come on.
Mm-hmm. And getting worse for younger people, like kids.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is, only going to get more and more expensive over the life of that person with medical costs and reduced productivity and the military. I mean, there's so many, if you look at that, it's really extensive there. Well, Moises, I think your book is certainly ahead of its time. You published this, was it the end of 2012?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're certainly, I mean, just now we're starting to see the microbiome literature in terms of like lay press and books explode. As I mentioned earlier, it's a kitchen table topic now. A lot of people are aware of it. But, back at the end of 2012, 2013, I mean, although the microbiome project was being conducted, people didn't know about this. So I think you're definitely an early adopter. A lot of relevant stuff in this book. I can't recommend it highly enough. Again, it's called Epidemic of Absence. I would highly recommend folks check that out. You can also look at the show notes. If you're listening over to this in iTunes or watching this over on YouTube, thanks for tuning in. The show notes will be posted on highintensityhealth.com, which is our blog and so forth. So Moises, as we part ways, how can folks learn more about you and your work, and what can they expect from you in the future?
Well, I'll continue covering this area as it develops. I'll uncover more and more. You can go to my website. It's moisesvm.com, and that's where I sort of post my articles as they come out. I mean, I'll continue watching it. I think it's interesting, and I also think that there's hype. There's a lot of hype, especially in the microbiome. But I don't think that we should let the hype blind us either. To the real possibilities, and hopefully they're forthcoming soonish, and that won't take too long.
Well, keep up the great work. Thanks for writing such an amazing book, and hope you have an awesome day.
Hey, thanks for having me.